My name is Helen Myers. I'm 68 years old. I live in a cedar house just outside Des Plaines, Illinois. For most of my life, I worked in silence, never asking to be seen, only to be useful. What I did for a living? I built systems. Not just the kind that run on machines, but the kind that hold people together when everything else falls apart. I was the co-founder and former chief operating officer of Lydian Systems, one of the first tech startups in the Midwest to reach $1 billion in market cap without a penny of outside funding. But if you asked my daughter's fiancé, Brandon, I was just a retired nobody. And for months, I let him believe it. Because sometimes, the loudest lesson is the one no one sees coming. It happened on a Saturday afternoon, beneath the high vaulted ceilings of Riverstone Lodge, the kind of wedding venue that smells like fresh-cut pine and old money. I remember the hum of conversation, the soft clink of champagne glasses, and the way sunlight filtered through the tall windows like gold lace. Everything was beautiful. Or at least, it was supposed to be. I stood near the edge of the reception room, admiring the hydrangeas Laura had chosen for the centerpieces, blue and white, just like her baby blanket. It's funny, the things that come back to you when no one's looking. Then I saw him, Brandon, my future son-in-law, approaching with quick, eager steps, the kind that make too much noise on marble floors. He was leading a man beside him, a tall figure in a navy suit, his silver hair neat, his presence commanding without trying. I knew that walk before I even saw the face. Alan Roth, CEO of Lydian Systems, my former colleague, my former protege, and the man Brandon was desperate to impress. Brandon reached our table with that signature grin, charming to most, smug to the trained eye. "This," he said, placing a proud hand on Alan's back, "is Mr. Roth, my boss, one of the greats." Then he turned to me, smiling like a politician trying to look humble. "And this," he added with a casual shrug, "is Helen, my fiancé's mom. She's just retired, keeps things simple these days, just retired, keeps things simple." I didn't flinch, I didn't even blink. I just nodded once, polite and quiet. Alan's eyes flicked toward me. The moment lasted less than a heartbeat. But I saw it. Recognition, then shock, then something else, warmth and a hint of awe. He extended his hand with purpose, and then he chuckled. "Helen Myers?" he said, gripping my hand like an anchor. "God, it's good to finally see you again." "Partner?" I watched Brandon's smile falter, his brow furrowed, his grip on the champagne glass loosened. The word partner didn't land softly. It dropped like a piano. "Partner?" he repeated, voice hollow. Alan looked at him, then back at me, as if double-checking what he already knew. "We built Lydian Systems together," he said, plainly. "Everything you stand on now? That's her foundation." Brandon froze, and for the first time since I met him, he didn't say a word. The air around us shifted. Conversation slowed. Forks stopped midair. Someone near the band took a step back. Even the violinist lowered her bow. All eyes turned to our corner of the room. But I didn't move. I didn't gloat. I didn't correct him. Because you don't need to raise your voice when the truth walks in wearing cufflinks. I looked down briefly, just enough for Alan to follow my gaze, to the black opal cufflinks Charles had given me in '98, the day we signed our first federal contract. Alan saw them. Of course he did. "Those still look sharp," he said softly. I gave a faint smile. Brandon was pale now, like someone who'd just been told the name of the judge he insulted in the hallway. He tried to say something. His mouth opened, but no words came out. No defense, no recovery, no spin. He couldn't say a word. But his silence said everything. And that was enough. Because I didn't need to make a scene. I didn't need revenge. The moment spoke louder than I ever could. That's the thing about quiet women. You think we're invisible until we're the headline. The thing about moments like that, when someone's mask falls, is they don't happen in isolation. They're part of a pattern. And patterns? I've always been good at seeing them. Long before that handshake at the wedding, there were signs. I remember the first time I sat down to dinner with Brandon. It was early spring, the week after Laura told me they were engaged. She wanted us to have a proper family dinner. Her words. So she made a reservation at an upscale restaurant in Lincoln Park. Dark wood walls, candlelight, waiters in pressed white shirts. It was a place I knew well. We'd helped fund the remodel back when the owners were struggling to modernize their payment system. That system, the one Brandon tapped his phone against to check in, it ran on software I'd co-developed 12 years ago. He didn't know that. Of course he didn't. The hostess led us to a quiet table near the fireplace. Laura looked radiant, flushed with love and excitement. Brandon wore a navy blazer too tight in the shoulders and smiled like he was applying for something. He pulled my chair out, mechanically, and launched into stories about quarterly projections and office politics. I listened politely, sipping water with lemon. When the waiter came, Laura ordered first, a lemon-thyme chicken with asparagus risotto. Brandon leaned back in his seat, confidently pointing at the wild mushroom filet mignon with white truffle reduction. "I like to celebrate milestones properly," he said, half winking at Laura. "Can't put a price on taste." Then the waiter turned to me. I glanced at the menu briefly. "I'll have the soup of the day and the house salad," I said. There was a moment, a beat too long. Brandon raised his eyebrows, tilted his head. "Just soup? You sure, Helen?" I smiled gently. "Quite sure." He chuckled. "Don't feel like splurging tonight?" Laura looked between us, suddenly uncomfortable. Brandon kept going. "My mom always says soups for when you're on a budget. But hey, everyone has different priorities, right?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. I reached for my water, and as I lifted the glass, my cuff slid slightly. The candlelight caught the edge of my left wrist. The black opal cufflink glinted once, deep blue with flecks of violet like a midnight sky in winter. Subtle, understated, but unmistakable. Brandon didn't notice. He assumed I ordered soup because I was poor. He didn't know I designed the algorithms that paid for the restaurant's entire POS system. I let the silence stretch. Not passive, just present. He filled it, of course, talking about margins, market shifts, emerging trends in tech sales. He was eager to prove himself to me, but only on his terms. He wanted to be seen as successful, but not challenged. And in that moment, I saw it clearly, how he equated simplicity with lack, restraint with deficiency, quiet with irrelevance. He didn't understand that sometimes power wears soft cotton and orders tomato bisque. Laura tried to change the subject. Bless her heart. She asked about my garden. The tulips were coming in early that year. I told her so. Brandon nodded, but I could see he wasn't listening. He was watching the couple across the room, probably comparing watches, estimating salaries. When the food arrived, I stirred my soup slowly, letting the warmth move through my hands. Brandon cut into his steak with flair, chewing with visible satisfaction. He glanced at my plate once and gave a half smile. Minimalist. That's a trend now, right? I met his eyes and said nothing. Because what was there to say? Sometimes silence is sharper than sarcasm, and sometimes soup is enough. Later that evening, Laura walked me to the car. The wind was cool, and she pulled her coat tighter. "Did you enjoy tonight?" she asked softly. I nodded. It was illuminating. She looked at me, eyebrows drawn. "Mom, you're not upset, are you?" I touched her hand. "No, sweetheart. I'm not upset. Not at him. Not anymore. Because I've learned something in my years. When someone shows you who they are in a small moment, believe them. Brandon showed me. And I listened. Not with words, but with silence. Brandon never asked me what I did before I retired. Not once. He asked if I liked gardening. He asked whether I needed help setting up my new phone. He even asked what store I bought my shoes from. "They look comfortable," he said, as if that were a compliment. But not once did he ask me what I built my life around. And I never volunteered the answer. It's not that I was hiding. It's just that I learned over time that people who only look at the surface don't deserve the depth. One afternoon, not long after the dinner at Lincoln Park, Laura came by for tea. She brought a basket of honey scones, and that concerned wrinkle between her brows. I knew that look. It was the same one she had as a child when she'd broken my reading glasses and tried to tape them back together with pink glitter stickers. We sat in the kitchen. The light was soft and golden, pouring through the linen curtains. The kettle whistled gently as I poured hot water into 2 porcelain cups, mine with violets, hers with daffodils, a matching set, a wedding gift from a friend who'd long since passed. Laura stirred in honey, then looked up at me. "Mom," she said, "can I ask you something?" I nodded. "Always." She hesitated. "Why don't you ever tell Brandon what you used to do?" I smiled gently. I'd been waiting for this question. "Because, sweetheart," I said, "if someone only sees what's visible, they're not ready for what's hidden." She didn't reply right away, just sat there, looking into her tea like it held some kind of answer. "I think he'd understand if he knew," she offered. I shook my head slowly. If he had the eyes to understand it, he would have asked. I saw her heart pull in 2 directions at once, love and loyalty on one side, truth and instinct on the other. People think silence is avoidance. It's not. Silence is clarity. When Charles died, I stepped down from everything. I'd spent 3 decades helping him build Lydian systems, building algorithms, running operations, managing teams, solving crises no one ever knew existed. We were a team. He was the dreamer. I was the anchor. When his heart gave out one cold January morning, I felt the axis of my world shift. I made one final boardroom appearance the following month. Then I packed up my office, declined all advisory positions, and walked away. Not because I had nothing left to give, but because I needed to learn how to be me without him. The tech world doesn't know what to do with widows, especially ones who still have power. I chose quiet, and in that quiet, I rebuilt a life. After we finished our tea, I invited Laura upstairs. I don't often take people into my study. It's not a secret room, but it's personal, intimate, a place not meant for performance. The door creaked open to reveal soft yellow light, a wide oak desk, and a tall wooden cabinet with brass handles. The cabinet was Charles's idea. He had it custom-made from reclaimed church pews in Iowa, said it was worthy of the weight it would carry. Inside, everything was labeled, filed, preserved. 3 patent certificates in my name, 1 federal grant approval with my signature beside the department's seal, the original partnership contract between Charles, myself, and Alan Roth, and a faded photo of the 3 of us standing in front of the garage where Lydian Systems was born. I was wearing a sweatshirt 2 sizes too big and holding a soldering iron. Laura stepped closer. Her fingers hovered over the photo, then rested on the edge of the frame. "I remember this," she said softly. "I think I was 4 when this was taken." "You were napping in the back seat," I replied. She turned to look at me, something shifting in her expression. "You kept all of this?" I nodded. "Some stories don't need to be retold, but they should be remembered." She swallowed. "Do you miss it?" I paused before answering. I miss building something that mattered, but I don't miss needing to prove I belonged. Outside the window, wind rustled through the maple trees. Laura stepped back from the cabinet, her hands folded in front of her. She looked smaller somehow, or maybe just softer. "Do you ever wish people knew?" I met her eyes. "The people who need to know do." Brandon didn't, and that told me everything I needed. She didn't argue. She just nodded, slowly. Before she left that day, she looked back at the study. "I hope one day," she said, "someone asks about this. And I hope I can answer like you." I reached out and squeezed her hand. "You will," I said. "But first, you have to decide what you'll let them forget." It was one of those quiet mornings that made you grateful for knees that still worked and tomatoes that still ripened. The kind where the dew lingers, just a bit longer on the leaves, and the soil crumbles warm in your palm. I was in my garden, as usual, my hands deep in the dirt, gently pressing a young tomato plant into the earth. My back ached, but there was something healing in planting life with your own fingers. After David passed, this garden became my chapel, my confession booth, my refuge. No judgment here, just sun, soil, and slow patience. Then came the sound of a car door slamming. I straightened slowly, brushing dirt from my knees. Through the lattice of rose bushes and mint, I saw Brandon's slick black SUV parked at the curb. Out stepped my son-in-law, looking like he had stepped out of a catalog. All polished loafers and smug efficiency. He walked toward me, carefully avoiding the stepping stones like they were landmines. The smell of lavender and compost hit him, and I watched the corners of his mouth twitch with subtle disapproval. He didn't belong here. Not in this world of slow-growing things. "Morning, Helen," he said, holding out a cream-colored envelope. "Thought I'd drop this off myself." I took the envelope without opening it. The weight and texture told me what it was before I even looked. Wedding invitation. Embossed, likely overpriced. "Thank you," I said, soft and measured, wiping my hands on my apron before motioning toward the porch. "Would you like some iced tea?" "I brewed it fresh this morning." He hesitated. No, I've got a meeting soon." Of course. There was always a meeting. Always somewhere else more important than where he was. He glanced around the garden, his gaze lingering on the trellises heavy with green beans and the neat rows of herbs I'd cultivated over the years. I could see it in his eyes. The judgment, the misinterpretation. "At least you've found some purpose post-retirement," he said with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was meant as a jab, a dismissal dressed in civility. He thought he was being clever. I didn't flinch. I just smiled and replied, "The garden's been good for me." He didn't understand. He wasn't meant to. He tapped his car key against his palm. Laura mentioned you used to be in tech or something? You must get bored out here. I tilted my head slightly, pretending to think. Not really. Watching things grow is more satisfying than watching graphs. He laughed politely, then glanced at his watch. Well, enjoy the tomatoes. See you at the wedding? I nodded. Drive safe. He turned and walked off, his loafers crunching gravel. I stayed rooted to the spot, watching until his SUV disappeared down the street. The air settled again. Quiet returned, faithful as ever. I walked inside and stood by the window, the envelope still in my hand. I watched the breeze play with the curtains and listened to the hum of the garden, like a living, breathing choir outside. And I whispered to no one, purpose never left. You just don't recognize quiet things. It wasn't just about Brandon. It was about how the world worked now. Everything loud, brash, measured by noise and status and who could shout the fastest. But me? I'd found strength in silence. There was power in not correcting him, in letting him assume, in the way I served tea without defending my past, my choices, my identity. He would never know that the chair he sat on during last Thanksgiving, the one that never wobbled, was engineered by a woman he thought was only good for planting basil. He would never know that the POS system used in his finance firm's cafeteria still paid me licensing royalties. That the quiet things in his life were, in part, built by the woman he couldn't bother to ask about. I looked down at the cufflink I had left on the kitchen table, the one with the black stone. The match to the one David wore the day he proposed. Brandon didn't notice it when he visited last time. No one does, but it was there, like purpose, like truth, unmoving, quiet, waiting. And I, the widow in the garden, was just getting started. I always knew Brandon had a performative streak. He didn't just want things to be good. He wanted them to look good, sound good, appear impressive to all the right people. And no event fed that hunger better than the wedding he was planning with Laura. It was early spring when I first overheard him mention the Riverstone. I was sitting in the sunroom, sorting seed packets, while Laura and Brandon stood in the adjacent dining room with papers scattered across the table. Pamphlets, pricing sheets, vendor cards. The glass door between us was slightly ajar. I didn't intend to eavesdrop, but I also didn't move. "The Riverstone Hotel," Brandon said, tapping the glossy brochure as if it were a sacred scroll. "It's the only venue that makes sense." Laura's voice was softer, hesitant. "It's extravagant. I thought we were leaning toward the Coastal Garden place. Something more intimate." Brandon gave a short, flat laugh. "Babe, come on. You don't invite Alan Roth to a wedding at a garden center?" The name sliced the air like cold wind. Alan Roth. I paused, fingers still in the envelope of basil seeds. Laura said nothing. Just the light clinking of teacups as she cleared 2 mugs from the table. "I want him there," Brandon continued. "We're finalizing that investment deal next quarter. And if he's impressed with the way I handle personal logistics, he'll take the leap. And that man doesn't leap easily." I could almost see him rehearsing this pitch in a mirror somewhere. "Does he even know you?" Laura asked, a touch of annoyance slipping in. "He knows enough. And by the time he sits through a wedding at the Riverstone, with the kind of guest list we'll have, he'll remember me." There it was. It wasn't about the wedding. It wasn't about the love. It was about the deal, the optics, the ego. My heart didn't ache. It didn't even flinch. I'd spent too many years in boardrooms not to recognize the scent of ambition when it thickened the air. Still, as I listened, a strange chill ran through me. Not because Brandon was calculating. No, I already knew that. But because Alan Roth had once been part of my world. I had gifted Alan that very watch Brandon now wore, the brushed steel Patek Philippe with the deep navy face and moon phase dial. It was a gift to mark the IPO, back when Alan was my co-founder, my partner in nights spent coding and days spent deflecting venture capital vultures. Brandon didn't know, of course. He wore the watch like a man flaunting a prize, without knowing what it had cost. Later that evening, I passed by the hallway mirror and caught a glimpse of myself. My face, framed by silver curls, held no surprise, only a stillness I'd learned to wear like silk. But I paused and looked closer. My lips formed a tight smile, not of joy, but of recognition. A ghost of my younger self flickered beneath the surface. In that moment, I realized how time doesn't always blur things. Sometimes it sharpens them. At dinner a few days later, I saw the watch again, its polished face catching the chandelier light as Brandon raised his wine glass. He was discussing the seating arrangement for the wedding. "I think Roth should be at table 1, he said casually. "You know, center stage. He'll be seated next to that guy from the equity firm. It'll show him we're serious players." Laura glanced at me quickly, then looked away. "Sounds like a business conference," she murmured. Brandon smiled, not picking up on the tone. "Exactly." He turned to me then, flashing his white teeth. "Right, Helen? The Riverstone's got that old world charm, doesn't it?" I met his gaze and nodded, serene. "It does," I said, "though it's only impressive if you know what's behind the walls." He blinked, unsure if I was making a point. I let the silence settle between us. That night, I went up to my study and opened the antique wooden cabinet. It creaked faintly, as if aware it was rarely disturbed. Inside, neatly stored in acid-free sleeves and embossed folders, were the remnants of a life Brandon never thought to ask about. Certificates, patents, founding documents. The original prototype sketch for our company's first algorithm, still drawn in smudged pencil on lined graph paper. On the top shelf sat a photograph. Alan, myself, and 3 other colleagues, laughing after our first round of Series A funding. I was wearing a red blazer. Alan had his arm slung casually over my shoulder. I closed the cabinet carefully and sat down in the leather chair by the window. I thought about purpose. Brandon thought it was something you retire from, something you trade in for gardening tools and soup orders and guest room quilts. He didn't know that purpose, once found, never truly leaves you. It simply waits, quietly, patiently, for its name to be called again. And if no one bothers to ask your name, that's fine, because some of us carry legacy not in titles or introductions, but in the quiet turning of gears beneath a luxury watch, in the ink of papers stored behind old oak, and in the eyes of daughters who do remember. The wedding plans would continue. The guest lists would be printed. The Riverstone would be booked. And I would be watching, not to intervene, but to remember. And when the time came, because time always comes, I would speak, but only once, and only when it mattered. There's a drawer in my study that hasn't been opened in years. It's the middle one, the one with the brass handle, slightly crooked from when Brandon was 8, and yanked it too hard trying to find colored pencils. I'd left it alone for so long, letting the dust settle over it like a forgotten story. But this morning, after his visit, I felt something pull at me. A quiet nudge, a whisper maybe. I sat at my desk, reached out slowly, and pulled. The hinges groaned in protest, like they, too, remembered what was inside. There it was, the old photograph. The corners had curled ever so slightly. I held it between my fingers like it was made of glass. It was me and Charles, standing in front of the garage that started it all. Lydian Systems hadn't been a company yet, just an idea, a bunch of soldered wires, code scribbled on napkins, and nights spent arguing over whether we could afford a second-hand oscilloscope. In the photo, Charles's arm was slung over my shoulder, grease on his cheek, eyes squinting from the sun. My face was flushed, not from the heat, but from laughing, really laughing, the kind that starts in your belly and shakes everything loose. We were young, scrappy, and so foolishly hopeful. Tucked behind the photo was the document, the partnership agreement, still in its original manila folder. I slid it out carefully, smoothing it on the desk. At the bottom were 3 signatures, mine, Charles's, and, yes, there it was, Alan Roth. He was barely out of MIT then, brilliant, cocky, but Charles saw something in him. We both did. He became our third mind, the strategist to our builders. We worked out of that same garage for 3 years before we pitched to our first VC. And now my son wore a watch I once gave to Alan on the morning our company went public. It had been engraved. I remember the exact words, to Alan, for the long nights, the crazy bets, and the belief that got us here. -H. It wasn't sentimental, just honest. I didn't know how Brandon ended up with it. Maybe Alan had gifted it, maybe not. But watching that gleaming silver on my son's wrist, worn like a trophy, something inside me folded in on itself. I reached for my yellow legal pad, the kind I always kept nearby, even after retirement. Its color reminded me of sunlit plans, of fresh starts, of quiet revolutions made with ink. I uncapped my pen and hovered it for a moment. Then I wrote, "Charles, he's not you. He's just loud." The words spilled from my hand without hesitation. I underlined them once. It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't grief. It was clarity, the kind that only comes when you've let things steep long enough in silence. Brandon had Charles's jawline, his walk. But the soul, that fire built from humility, from listening more than speaking, that part was missing. Brandon built nothing. He inherited structures already standing and then mistook their solidity for his own strength. I flipped to a fresh page and started jotting down names. A list of people, old colleagues, former interns, early-day engineers who had helped us with soldering boards in exchange for pizza and floor space. Some of them had become CEOs. Some had vanished into other lives. I wasn't writing for sentiment. I was thinking. Because something was shifting, and I needed to remember where the real roots were. Outside, I could hear birds, the soft cooing of mourning doves, and for a moment, I felt the weight of time, not in a sad way, just real, present. My fingers brushed the edge of the photograph again. I studied Charles's smile. I hadn't spoken to his memory in a while. So I did. You'd laugh at the suits they wear now. And the language, disruption, scale, hypergrowth. Remember when we just wanted to build something that didn't crash every hour? My voice caught a little. I laughed through it. Brandon thinks legacy is a thing you display, I whispered. But you and I, we knew better. We knew it's the things you plant and walk away from, the shade others get to sit under. The drawer was still open. I placed the photograph back inside, carefully, but left the agreement on the desk. Not to flaunt, not to prove anything, just as a reminder of how it started, of who I'd been, who I still was, even if no one asked. I didn't need a stage. I'd never needed a spotlight. But sometimes, just sometimes, even the quiet ones have to speak. And maybe it was time. I closed the legal pad, tapping it gently as if sealing something important. Outside, the wind shifted. The tomato vines swayed like they were listening. Brandon showed up with Laura on a Sunday afternoon. He didn't text first. He rarely did anymore. I heard their SUV pull up while I was tending to the hydrangeas near the gate. Laura stepped out first, heels too high for the gravel, sunglasses still on. Brandon walked behind her with a white envelope tucked under his arm and a look that always made me feel like I was being evaluated. "Mom?" he said, not quite smiling. "We brought something for you." I dusted my gloves off and motioned toward the porch. "Lemonade's cold." They followed me in, Laura brushing imaginary dust from her dress. She looked around my house like it belonged in a museum. Once seated, Brandon handed me the envelope. I opened it slowly. Inside was a glossy trifold packet with the heading, "Style Recommendations for the Riverstone Ceremony." Beneath that, someone had written in marker, "We suggest muted tones, structured lines. Avoid flashy patterns or anything overly casual. Think polished, understated, elevated." And at the bottom, in Brandon's handwriting, "This helps everyone stay on theme for photos. Roth has classic taste." Laura chimed in with a smile too sweet to be genuine. "We're working with a stylist, just to keep everything cohesive." "It'll be beautiful," Brandon added. "It's important to present the family well." "Mr. Roth is traditional." I nodded once. "Yes, he is." The silence that followed was almost kind. Laura flipped through her phone. Brandon reached for his drink. I excused myself and walked back to my bedroom, taking the envelope with me. I sat at the edge of the bed and exhaled into my hands. Then I opened the closet. There, in a cloth garment bag, hung a suit. Charcoal gray, tailored decades ago. The stitching along the inner lapel bore 3 embroidered letters. HMC, my initials back when the world still called me Helen McCarthy. Long before I became just Mom or the widow. That suit was made by Hawthorne and Blake, a small tailor in Boston known only to a few. Charles had the whole leadership team fitted there the first year. "Lydian went public," he said. "We built this from scratch. Let's look like we did." I remember laughing when the tailor said, "You'll outdress half the men on Wall Street." And Charles responded, "She already outthinks them." I hadn't worn it in years, but it still held its shape, like dignity does when left untouched. I reached for the jacket, ran my fingers along the buttons. Real horn, not plastic. Beneath the lining, I'd once sewn a tiny charm, a sliver of hematite, for grounding. It was an old Irish tradition my grandmother swore by. That day, I didn't cry, but something settled in me. They thought they were helping. They thought I needed help knowing how to blend in. But I had no interest in blending into a family portrait staged like a performance. I had no desire to be rebranded as the quiet matriarch seated in the back row of someone else's version of legacy, because I knew where legacy started. It started in garages, in burnt coffee and sleepless nights, in letters of incorporation signed on a kitchen table with Charles, Alan Roth, and me, all using the same pen because we only had one that worked. They could dress it up with florals and string quartets and photo backdrops all they wanted. But I had already attended the real ceremony years ago. the one where the foundation was laid and the ink was still wet. Back in the living room, I returned with the suit slung gently over my arm. Brandon looked confused. "I appreciate the suggestions," I said, laying the garment on the armrest. "But I've already chosen." He stood up. "You sure, Mom? We really want the aesthetic to be unified." "I know," I said softly. "And this," I patted the lapel, "was designed for exactly that." Laura tilted her head. "It's beautiful. Where's it from?" "Hawthorne and Blake, Boston." I smiled. It was part of a tradition, one reserved for Lydian's founding team. The first official year. Custom fits for every leader. Brandon blinked. "This suit," I added, "stood beside Charles when he rang the bell at the stock exchange." It sat across from Roth when he signed the first expansion papers. I didn't have to say the rest. I saw it land. He looked down at his shoes, then back at me. "I didn't realize you kept all that." I smiled again, smaller this time. Some things keep themselves. Laura said nothing. For once. The quiet that followed wasn't awkward. It was necessary. Brandon gathered the empty glasses and carried them to the kitchen. Maybe out of habit. Maybe out of guilt. Laura stood to follow but hesitated. I watched them leave. Later that evening, I took the suit back to the bedroom and laid it out on the bed. I fetched a small brush from the drawer and cleaned the shoulders with care. Then I opened my legal pad, flipped past pages of notes and sketches, and jotted down a new line. Pride doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just wears a suit and waits. I circled it, then underlined it once, twice, and left the pen uncapped beside it. The tomatoes were ripening faster than I expected this season. I liked the way their skin shimmered in the sun, a kind of gentle defiance against time. I was bent low, clipping the stems with quiet precision, when I heard the soft crunch of gravel behind me. "Mom?" Laura's voice, gentle but tight around the edges. I stood and turned, brushing dirt from my gloves. She looked out of place in the garden, wearing a crisp cream blouse, and those ballet flats she always said were practical elegance. Her arms were crossed, not quite confrontational, but certainly braced. "I figured you'd be out here," she said, glancing at the rows of basil and cherry tomatoes. "It's where I do most of my thinking these days," I replied, offering a small smile. "What brings you over?" She hesitated, then sighed, stepping deeper between the rows, careful not to disturb the soil. "Why don't you stop this charade?" she said quietly, without looking at me. I let her words hang in the air. The wind was moving through the rosemary bush behind her, scattering its scent into the sun-warmed air. "What charade, sweetheart?" I asked softly. She finally met my eyes. The smiles. The nodding along. "You know what Brandon's doing, what this whole wedding is really about, and yet you keep playing along like it's normal." I looked down at the pruning shears in my hand. I could feel the old ache in my fingers again. Arthritis, from years of gripping and holding and working. I took my time before I spoke. "What do you see in him, sweetheart?" I asked. Not sharply, just honestly. Laura looked startled. She blinked once, then tilted her head. "He's ambitious. He gets things done. He has plans and direction." I nodded slowly. "He certainly moves with conviction." She crossed her arms tighter. "Is that your way of saying he's manipulative?" "I didn't say that," I said. Then, after a pause, I added, "But I do think you see him as someone who can carve paths where others hesitate." "And that's a bad thing?" I stepped closer, resting the shears on the edge of the raised bed. That depends. When someone stands in his way, what does he do? Laura frowned. He pushes. Sometimes hard, but he doesn't mean to hurt anyone. He just believes in outcomes. Outcomes, I repeated, the word tasting metallic in my mouth. She bit her lower lip. He's not evil, Mom. You're painting him like a villain in your head. I shook my head gently. No, Laura. I'm not painting him as anything. I'm asking you to look, really look. There was a silence between us then, layered with wind and the distant sound of someone mowing grass down the block. She sat on the old stone bench near the rosemary, the one Charles and I had dragged home from an estate sale 20 years ago. Why now? She asked finally. Why start asking these questions now, so close to the wedding? I crouched again beside the tomato vines, plucking a sun-warmed fruit from the stem. Because I didn't think I needed to. I thought you'd seen it for yourself already. And if I have, she whispered, if I've seen it and chosen to keep going anyway? Then that's your choice, I said gently. But choices have companions. They come with weight, and sometimes with silence. She looked at me sharply. You mean yours? No, I said. I mean his. Laura dropped her gaze. Her voice was smaller when she spoke next. He told me he asked Alan Roth to come to the wedding. I stood slowly. Of course he did. Because he wants to show him he's capable. I tilted my head. Or he wants something from him. She looked up at me, her eyes searching. What is this really about for you, Mom? Is it just that you don't like him? I smiled, softly, sadly. I don't need to like him. This isn't about tea parties or preferences. It's about how people treat power, about whether they think it gives them the right to mold others to their will. And you think Brandon does that? I think, I said carefully, that he doesn't know the difference between influence and love. And I think you might not either. Not yet. Laura was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet I used to hear in her when she was 10, sitting on the porch after a bad grade, pretending not to cry. She used to need time to process things slowly. Never reactive, just deep. She stood finally, brushing off her skirt. You're not going to stop me, are you? No, I said. I'm going to be there. In my seat. Wearing what you asked. Smiling when the music starts. She gave me a confused look. But I won't be quiet forever, I added. And if there comes a time when your heart says it needs to be heard, you'll know where to find me. Laura looked down again. She nodded just once and turned toward the gate. I watched her walk away, her posture a little less sure than when she'd arrived. I returned to the tomatoes. The sun had shifted, casting a long shadow across the rosemary bush. I thought of Charles, how he used to say, "Pride doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just stays." I hoped Laura remembered that. Because pride isn't always arrogance. Sometimes it's simply refusing to abandon what you quietly know to be true. I woke early that morning. The house was still, the way I always liked it, that sacred stillness before anything had a chance to go wrong. Outside, the light was pale and bluish, brushing over the edges of the garden like a watercolorist's first touch. I stood by the window for a long time, sipping coffee gone lukewarm. In the distance, the doves had already begun their slow procession across the sky. Today was the day. I dressed slowly, deliberately, as though time might stretch itself if I moved carefully enough. The charcoal gray suit I'd chosen wasn't new, but it had age in the right places. the subtle sheen at the elbow, the faint press of old shoulder pads, all carried with the dignity of things that had lasted. On the bed, I laid out the final details. The black onyx cufflinks Charles had given me on our 25th anniversary, still resting in their original velvet box. I fastened them with steady hands. And then, the envelope. I took it from my desk drawer, where it had waited quietly for weeks. A cream-colored envelope, the name handwritten in clean cursive strokes. Laura and Brandon. In the bottom corner, embossed so faintly you'd miss it unless you knew what to look for, were the words, Myers Legacy Fund. Inside was the deed to a small property in Vermont, a house with strong bones, and a lake behind it, one Charles and I had purchased years ago. We had planned to retire there. She didn't know about it. No one did. Until now. Not because I thought they needed another house, but because sometimes a legacy isn't about what's handed over. It's about what's remembered. As I tucked the envelope into my clutch, I felt something tighten in my chest. Not pain, not fear, just gravity. By the time we arrived at the venue, everything had already begun to shimmer under the weight of ceremony. The Riverstone Hotel had done its part well. Manicured hedges, soft violin playing near the terrace, staff dressed in quiet perfection. I caught my reflection briefly in the mirror as I passed the powder room. The cufflinks gleamed beneath the sleeves. My hair, brushed into place with a kind of reverence, held its silver like a crown. I didn't feel old. I felt full. With memory, with meaning. In the bridal suite, Laura stood before a full-length mirror, draped in soft satin and lace. She looked ethereal, not quite real, the kind of beauty that makes you hesitate to speak. She turned when she saw me. There was something in her face that stopped me. Not coldness, not hesitation, but distance. A polite detachment that hadn't been there when she was a girl and used to climb into bed beside me just to fall asleep, listening to my breathing. "Hi, Mom," she said, smiling. "You look sharp." I smiled back. "So do you." She turned toward the mirror again, adjusting the veil slightly. The room was full of motion. Stylists whispering, someone fussing over her bouquet, the soft clink of champagne glasses. But in the middle of it all, we were an island, still, unspoken. "Do you need anything?" I asked. She hesitated, just a flicker. "No, I'm good," I nodded. Then, slowly, almost instinctively, I stepped forward and offered my hand. She looked at it for a second, perhaps surprised, but then placed hers in mine. It was a ritual we had done 1,000 times before. Crossing the street, getting on escalators, late-night hospital visits. But this time it felt final. We walked that way to the edge of the aisle, where the soft piano chords had begun. The guests rose. Hundreds of eyes turned. My hand didn't tremble, but I felt her fingers shift slightly in mine. Not to hold on, but to say, "I've got it from here." And maybe she did, but I still gave her my hand. One last time. We paused at the entry, just long enough for the moment to settle into something deeper than breath. Then slowly, gracefully, I passed her hand over to Brandon. He looked confident, too confident. That practiced smile, that squared jaw, that barely concealed glint of ambition, like a knife in a velvet case. But this was not my moment to speak. It was my moment to witness. So I stepped back. As the vows began, I made my way to the front row. I sat still, hands clasped, eyes dry. Not because I wasn't moved, but because I'd learned long ago that tears don't always serve you in public. Next to me, someone whispered, "She looks beautiful." I nodded, but my mind had already drifted, not to dresses or flowers, but to the envelope tucked neatly away, and to the house by the lake. To the future I had quietly rewritten just in case. Just in case her pride ever turned into regret. Just in case her ambition ever left her stranded. Just in case someone who claimed to love her forgot what real love looked like. The ceremony ended with applause and camera flashes. People rose to head for cocktails. But I sat for a moment longer, staring at the arch of white roses where my daughter had just stood. And I smiled. Not because I trusted him, but because I trusted her. The part of her that was still mine. The part that remembered long walks in the rain, and Sunday pancakes, and stories whispered after nightmares. That part would return someday. Until then, I'd wait. The reception hall was all soft lighting and spotless white linen, the air tinged with champagne and the faint fragrance of lilies. From the far end, a jazz trio played something breezy and inoffensive. I stood near the table they'd assigned me, table 14, by the floral arrangements, but conveniently far from the main stage. I didn't mind. I had learned over the years that sometimes the best seat in the house is the one no one expects you to take. I just set down my clutch, small, navy, the same one I used when Charles and I attended Roth's annual board dinners, when I caught sight of Brandon weaving through the crowd. His hand was pressed gently but insistently on the back of an older man. There was something sharp in Brandon's smile. Practiced. Like a campaign handshake before the cameras clicked. As they came closer, the man's profile became clear. Alan Roth. Hair a little whiter, perhaps. Shoulders less square than I remembered, but unmistakably him. The same man who used to argue with Charles until 2 a.m. about modular systems and scalable ethics, then send us wine the next day as if to say, "Still friends?" My heart beat a little slower, not faster, slower as if my whole body were bracing itself. Brandon reached my side, still gripping Roth's back as if afraid the man might float away. "Mr. Roth," he began with that voice he used in every elevator pitch I'd overheard. "This is Helen, just Laura's mom, retired, keeps things simple." I turned my face to them and smiled, gently. Roth's gaze landed on me. At first, there was confusion. Then, like the slow burn of a fuse reaching the charge, it shifted. Recognition. He took a beat longer than necessary before offering his hand. When I reached for it, his grip was firm, familiar. Then he said, loud enough for nearby tables to catch, but soft enough to feel intimate, "Helen Myers." The only one in the room I'd trust with a budget and a battlefield. The words didn't come with ceremony. They came with memory. Brandon froze. The practiced smile faltered, then faded entirely. He blinked, once, then again, as if his brain couldn't compute the overlap of worlds. I could almost hear the wires crossing in his head. Budget? Battlefield? Roth kept holding my hand. "You still wear Charles's cufflinks," he noted with a small, respectful nod toward my sleeves. He always said black onyx grounded a room. I see he was right. I smiled softly. "He'd be pleased you remembered." Roth leaned slightly forward, warmth in his tone. I never forget the people who helped me build Lydian, especially not the ones who carried the weight when the others dropped it. I didn't respond right away. I didn't need to. The silence between us said enough about old wars, late-night negotiations, The broken coffee machine we all hated but refused to replace because Charles insisted it taught patience. Brandon cleared his throat. Wait, I'm sorry, Mr. Roth. You know each other? His voice cracked halfway through. Roth tilted his head, amused. Know her? Brandon, Helen built Lydian's West Coast operations, while juggling a toddler and a husband with pneumonia. You ever try setting up 6 supply chains across international waters during a port strike? She has. Twice Brandon's face was now the color of unpolished porcelain. His jaw tightened just slightly, micro-expressions he hadn't yet learned to hide. I didn't gloat, but I also didn't rescue him. Roth's voice lowered, now just between the two of us. I still remember that garage on Cypress. You, Charles, and the first server rack that looked like it was welded by optimism alone. That rack ran for 6 years, I replied, smiling. Charles taped a fortune cookie to it that said, "The future is not a mystery. It's a blueprint." Roth chuckled, and he was right. Brandon's eyes darted between us like he was watching a play in a language he'd never learned. Anyway, Roth finally said, gently releasing my hand, I just had to say hello. And thank you, I inclined my head. The thanks goes both ways. He smiled and began to turn away, then paused, looking over his shoulder. Oh, and Helen, he added, we could use your eyes again. Strategy, not day-to-day. If you're ever bored of retirement, I offered a polite chuckle. If I get bored, you'll be the first to know. As Roth melted back into the crowd, shaking hands and laughing with younger men in sleeker suits, I turned to face Brandon fully. His lips were pressed thin. No smile, no words. Just that sharpness in his eyes now dulled into something else. Uncertainty. In that moment, he wasn't my daughter's polished fiancé or some rising star in venture circles. He was just a boy who'd underestimated the wrong woman. And I didn't have to say a single word to prove it. Brandon stood there, blinking, as though his mind were short-circuiting. His lips parted, then closed again. And then, finally, You're the Helen Myers? His voice cracked slightly on my name. Not with reverence. No, not yet. With fear. A delayed realization clawing its way into the room, dragging 100 unspoken consequences behind it. Before I could answer, Alan Roth placed a steady hand on Brandon's shoulder, his own voice composed and resolute. She's the Helen Myers, he said, not looking at Brandon anymore, but turning to face me with something bordering on solemn respect. And with that, the air in the room changed. Not in a dramatic, cinematic sort of way, but in a deeper, more reverberating silence. A silence that spreads like ink in water, controlled, unignorable. I felt every gaze slowly begin to shift. Faces that had been politely indifferent at first now turned with recognition, or confusion, or, in some cases, a quiet reverence that only comes when legends are no longer abstract. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Brandon's mouth opened again, but the words failed to come out. He looked like someone who had stepped onto a stage thinking he knew the script, only to realize the story was never about him. Not even remotely. I tilted my head ever so slightly, a gesture so minimal that it might have been mistaken for a nod, or a dismissal. I didn't plan it. It just happened, like breath. Then, from just beyond the circle of the closest tables, a man stepped forward. Late 60s, maybe early 70s. Balding, his tie slightly askew, but his posture told me everything before he even said a word. He recognized me. He didn't ask. He didn't hesitate. He simply walked up to me and said, "Miss Myers. I interned in regulatory with Lydian in '94. You probably don't remember me." I looked into his eyes, pale blue, softened with time. "But I remember you," he added, his voice almost reverent now. "You were the reason we had policies. You were the reason we had people who stayed." There was a moment of pause. He extended his hand, not in assumption, but in hope. I shook it. And then, without further preamble, he bowed his head. Not a dramatic, theatrical bow, just a gentle dip of acknowledgement, of gratitude, of humility. I felt something swell in my chest. Not pride, exactly. Something quieter, older, grief maybe, for the years lost to silence, but also grace. Behind him, a few others began murmuring. Another woman, one of the venue managers perhaps, whispered something to her colleague and glanced at me with sudden recognition, like a long-lost puzzle piece clicking into place. Brandon hadn't moved. He looked shell-shocked. His eyes darted from Alan to me, to the man who bowed, and then back to me again. "You didn't tell us," he said finally, almost breathless. "You never—" I raised a hand slightly, not high, just enough to let the air know I was reclaiming space. "I didn't think it was relevant," I said, my voice calm. And that was the truth. Not a weapon, not a performance. Brandon, in his meticulously curated suit, stood there completely unraveling. I could see him recalculating every conversation, every glance, every patronizing remark he'd made in the past 2 years. Every time he assumed I didn't understand. Every time he spoke over me at dinner or called my choices sentimental. Alan Roth, on the other hand, looked almost amused. Not cruelly so, just intrigued, like a man who had discovered an unexpected twist in what he assumed was a straightforward deal. "I told your son earlier," Alan said, "that I trust track records over speeches." He glanced at Brandon once more, then excused himself politely and disappeared into the crowd, leaving the silence behind like a dropped microphone. Laura stood not far off, a half-drunk glass of champagne in her hand. Her expression unreadable. Her gaze bounced between the fragments of the moment. Her fiancé, visibly shrinking. Me, unmoved. The man who had bowed, now walking away. And the whispers beginning to ripple across the room. I didn't try to interpret her thoughts. That was her journey now. As for me, I returned to my seat, sat quietly. Let the moment pass without grabbing it. The true power of dignity, I've learned, lies not in the claiming, but in the restraint. A waitress passed by with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. She paused just a second longer than necessary and whispered, "You wore it well, ma'am." I nodded once, took a small olive tart. Behind me, the low murmur of the reception returned to its rhythm. Almost, but not quite, because something had shifted, not just in Brandon's mind. In the room, they saw me now, not just as Laura's mom, not just as a retiree who wore sensible shoes and smiled gently, but as someone who had built something, quietly, consistently, without demanding acknowledgement. And that kind of legacy speaks for itself. Sometimes the loudest thing you can say is nothing at all. And that was enough. The clinking of glasses faded into a hum, the music soft and pleasant, and the guests scattered across the reception hall in little pockets of laughter and celebration. I sat quietly near the back, hands folded neatly in my lap, watching as Laura drifted through the room like a vision. A new bride. A woman beginning a life. She looked radiant. She always had. But now there was something new in her expression, something thoughtful, a flicker of restraint beneath the joy. I caught her eye across the room. She paused. Then she moved toward me. We stepped outside together onto the stone terrace behind the ballroom. The evening air was cool and tasted faintly of champagne and magnolia. The golden haze of the setting sun rested gently on Laura's shoulders. She turned to me, her expression unreadable. "Why didn't you tell him earlier?" she asked. I didn't need her to clarify who him was. We both knew she meant Brandon. She meant Alan Roth. She meant the roomful of people whose laughter had choked into silence when the name Helen Myers turned out not to be a simple footnote in a wedding program, but a presence. I met her eyes, calm and steady, because how he treated me before knowing was the answer. She didn't respond right away. Her lips parted slightly, then closed again. She looked down at her hands, fidgeting now with the ribbon of her bouquet, the petals trembling with each movement. "I feel like I should have known," she whispered. "I should have seen it." "I'm not stupid." "No," I said gently. "You're not." But love has a way of making even the clearest signs blur. Laura shook her head, more frustrated with herself than with anyone else. "He made me believe you were just content with being small. I never questioned it. I thought you preferred the background." I smiled, just a little. "I did sometimes, but not because I was small." A silence settled between us, soft and heavy. Then she asked something harder, something quieter. "Was I blind, Mom?" I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't have words, but because the question carried a weight that deserved to sit in the open air a little longer. I could see how much it cost her to ask it, and how much she feared the truth. "You saw what you needed to see," I said finally. "We all do when we want things to work. When we love someone, we often rewrite their story in our minds to make it more beautiful." Her throat tightened. I could see it in the way she swallowed, in the way her jaw clenched, as if holding back a dam of regret. "I defended him," she said, voice breaking. "Every time you said something even remotely cautious, I shut you down. I told you were being paranoid." "Yes," I said. "You did." That stung. I could see it. But I didn't offer her comfort yet. I let her sit in that moment, the mirror of her own words, her own dismissals. "But you were never cruel," I added softly. "You were never like him." Laura nodded, her eyes glossy now. She sat down slowly on the edge of the stone planter, bouquet forgotten beside her. "He told me you were just lonely, that you were stuck in the past, that your little house and books and roses were the result of failing to be more a pause." I believed him. I moved closer and sat beside her. Not too close, just enough. "I don't blame you for wanting to believe your husband," I said. "It's natural to want your partner to be good, to think the best of them. But good men don't ask women to shrink." Laura stared ahead, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. "He always told me what to wear, how to speak at events, which people to befriend. I thought he was guiding me, helping me step into the life I deserved." "And when you hesitated?" I asked. She winced. "He called me ungrateful, weak, said I had my mother's complacency." I turned slightly toward her. "That's not complacency, Laura. It's restraint. Strength doesn't always speak loudly." The tears finally came, soft, slow, and quiet. She made no sound, just sat there, head bowed slightly, hands now limp in her lap, her wedding ring gleaming in the light. "I feel like I lost something," she murmured. You gained clarity, I said. That's always the beginning. She looked at me now. Really looked. Did you ever think about stopping the wedding? Yes, I said. More than once. Her eyes widened slightly. Then why didn't you? Because it wasn't my place, I replied. This wasn't a lesson I could teach with words. It had to unfold. But I could have avoided all this. Maybe, I said. But avoiding pain doesn't always equal growth. Sometimes walking through the fire is what forges us. She exhaled slowly, shaky. I feel like such a fool. I shook my head. No, sweetheart. A fool doesn't ask hard questions. A fool clings to the illusion. You're not doing that now. Laura reached for a napkin from her clutch and dabbed at her face. What happens now? That, I said gently, is entirely up to you. She looked down at her lap, then up at the glowing reception hall behind us. The flicker of lights, the laughter distant now. She was no longer fully inside that world. Something had shifted. I want to be different, she whispered. I want to grow into someone you'd be proud of. I touched her hand. I've always been proud of you. Even when you couldn't see me, I saw you. And for the first time that day, she leaned into me, not as a child seeking comfort, but as a woman seeking truth. I don't know how to begin, she said. You just did, I replied. The wedding had ended. The champagne flutes were drained, the confetti swept, and the last of the photographers had packed up their lenses. All that remained now were the thank you cards, the memories, and the envelopes. I had chosen mine with care, navy blue, thick paper, the kind you feel before you read. Inside, I'd placed a simple check, $50,000, made out to Laura Myers. Not Laura and Brandon, not Mr. and Mrs., just her name, bold, clear, and in cursive that still bore the sharp precision of years of drafting contracts and signing foundations into existence. I left the envelope on their gift table, angled slightly forward, tucked under a pale ivory ribbon. I didn't wait around for them to open it. That part wasn't mine. 3 days passed before the call came. I was standing in my garden, clipping away dead-headed roses, when my phone buzzed on the porch railing. I wiped my hands on my apron, walked over, and glanced down. Brandon. I let it ring once. Twice. I could have let it go to voicemail, but there was something about silence that already said enough. I answered. Helen? His voice cracked just slightly. We got your gift. Thank you. I didn't reply. I let the pause breathe. There's just one thing, he continued. It was addressed to Laura. Only, yes, I said simply. Right. I mean, was that intentional? I could hear the discomfort in his tone, the stumbling effort to remain polite while fishing for something deeper. It was, I answered. Another pause, then a forced chuckle. Okay. Just making sure we didn't lose a second envelope or something. No, I said gently. There was only one. And it was for her. He hesitated, then asked more carefully, May I ask why? I took a slow breath and looked out across the garden. The wind had just started to shift the wind chimes. They rang gently, a soft, metallic whisper. Love is shared, I said. Legacy is earned. The line went quiet. Right, he said too quickly. That's poetic. But it wasn't meant to be poetry. Brandon had spent years measuring me in surface-level metrics. How I dressed, how I kept to myself, how I showed up without fuss and left without drama. To him, I was just a mother, a background figure, retired, simple. But Laura had known better. She had watched me work late nights when she was young, buried beneath financial reports and strategic plans. She had seen my name engraved on the foundation plaque in the children's wing of the hospital, though she didn't say anything. She knew. And still, she chose to marry a man who once said, "Your mom doesn't really do much now, does she?" That was why the check had only her name. Not to shame, but to clarify. It was her name I trusted. Her name that had stood beside me when my husband passed, when I sold the consulting firm, when I redirected the family fund into educational scholarships and veteran recovery programs. She knew the value behind each dollar, the intention, the discipline, the quiet weight of stewardship. Brandon, on the other hand, had scoffed at caution, told Laura I was stingy when I hesitated to co-sign on their second vacation home loan. He hadn't earned trust. Not yet. "Do you think she'll share it?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "She can choose," I replied. A beat. Right. There was a tension in his breath, the kind that came when someone realized they'd asked the wrong question, in the wrong tone, to the wrong person. "I hope your honeymoon was peaceful," I said finally, shifting the air. "It was." "Paris was beautiful," he replied. I didn't comment on the irony. The same city where I'd once delivered a keynote on ethical wealth, a talk now quoted in financial circles. Brandon wouldn't have known. He had never Googled me. He ended the call shortly after. There was no apology, no gratitude beyond the transactional, just confusion wrapped in entitlement, cloaked in charm. I didn't blame him, but I wasn't going to enable him either. That evening, I received a message from Laura, just a single line. "I understand now." "And I'm sorry it took me so long," I wrote back. "You saw what you needed to see. That's all that matters." She didn't ask about the amount. She didn't ask about the legacy fund embossed faintly on the envelope. She just said, "I'm going to use it to start something of my own. Something that helps women like you once were. Powerful, but invisible." That made me smile. I walked back into the garage, the same garage Brandon once mocked, and ran my fingers along the outline of the vintage blueprint still pinned on the wall. The original design for the Roth-Myers Learning Center. They had no idea it started here, just like legacy does, quietly, deliberately, in places no one thinks to look. And for the first time in a long while, I felt peace. Because sometimes, the greatest gift isn't money. It's clarity. And mine was received, not by the one who shouted the loudest, but by the one who listened, even in silence. I sat alone on the old wooden bench beneath the birch tree, the same one that had stood like a patient friend outside my modest home for nearly 30 years. Its branches swayed gently in the early autumn breeze, yellow leaves catching the sunlight as they floated to the ground around me. Everything smelled of earth and memory. The world was quieter now. No wedding noise, no applause. Just the gentle rustle of the leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird passing by. In my lap rested the legal pad. The same legal pad I had picked up one afternoon, decades ago, when I sat at the kitchen table with a pencil in my hand and more fear in my chest than hope. I had no money, no job at the time, and no one but a toddler who looked up at me like I hung the moon. That toddler had just fallen asleep, her cheeks still sticky with peanut butter. That day, I began to plan. The first page was yellowed now, the ink slightly faded, but the line was still there, as clear as it was 30 years ago. Find a way to make sure Laura never has to feel small. Back then, it wasn't a financial plan. It was a prayer disguised as a to-do list. The first few entries were desperate and raw. Call the community college. See if Mrs. Henderson still needs help at the flower shop. Apply for the evening janitor job. I had no pride, just a need to build something, anything, that would keep her future safe. Page after page followed. Over the years, those pages turned from daily survival into investment ideas, tax research, strategies for opening a trust in her name, property options, estate law articles, notes from late-night reading. It was my quiet rebellion against scarcity, my silent fight for her dignity. And now, here I was, 3 decades later, adding just one more line. I flipped to the last page. The paper was crisp, new, untouched. I uncapped the pen and, with steady hands, wrote, "Legacy doesn't need a microphone. It just needs time I read the sentence aloud, softly." The wind caught my words and carried them into the leaves. It felt like closure, not the kind that slams a door, but the kind that lets a chapter breathe and settle, like dust in the morning sun. I smiled. Brandon's reaction to the wedding check still echoed in my mind. His voice on the phone, somewhere between disbelief and entitlement. "There's only her name?" he'd asked, as if that hadn't been the answer all along. I never responded directly. I had asked the bank to mail him the note instead. Just a small card tucked beside the copy of the check, my handwriting simple and unwavering. Love is shared. Legacy is earned, no threats, no explanations, just truth. It didn't need to be loud. I leaned back on the bench, my eyes tracing the way the sunlight danced between the fluttering birch leaves. The tree had grown with me. I'd planted it the year Laura started first grade. Back then, it was a twig with barely 5 leaves. Now, its shade covered half the yard. There was peace here, a peace I had built, not bought. The world still thought power came with microphones and announcements and introductions at black tie events. But I had come to know that the real kind, the kind that lasts, comes from living quietly, steadily, without the need to be seen. Because eventually, the world notices what's real, even if it takes time. A sharp, sudden giggle broke my reflection. I looked up. A little boy, probably 5 or 6, came running along the sidewalk with a red toy airplane in his hand. His steps were clumsy, enthusiastic, as he waved the plane above his head like it could really fly. Behind him, his mother pushed a stroller, waving as she noticed me. "Hi, miss." "Helen!" the boy called, mid-giggle, nearly tripping on the roots under the tree. "Hi there, Toby," I called back, chuckling. He darted off again, chasing the breeze with his plane, as if joy had no weight. And maybe, for children, it doesn't. Maybe that's the point. I watched them disappear down the sidewalk, the mother smiling back once more before turning the corner. I'd watched her grow up, helped her with algebra once, brought soup when her baby had a fever. She had told me once, in a whisper, "You're the safest grown-up I know." And now, her son ran past my tree like it was part of his world too. Not because of money, not because of anything grand, just because I had stayed kind, stayed consistent, stayed present. The pages of the legal pad fluttered again in the wind, landing gently on my lap like a reminder that even the smallest plans, held long enough, become something strong. I closed the pad, wrapped it in the elastic band I always used, and slipped it into the canvas bag beside me. I didn't need to look at it anymore. It had served its purpose. A gust of wind blew stronger, sending a swirl of leaves into the air. I lifted my face to it, closed my eyes, and breathed. I didn't need applause, didn't need to be reintroduced, to a world that once overlooked me. I had already won, not because I'd become the Helen Myers, but because I had remained Helen, still, whole, and free, under a birch tree that knew all my secrets and kept them like a friend. And in that moment, as the leaves danced, I felt something else. Not vindication, not triumph, but grace. The kind you only get after a long journey, when you finally understand that being seen was never the point. Being real was. The house was quiet again. The air had that soft, late afternoon glow that filtered through the kitchen blinds like old film. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and walked to the back room, where the wooden chest sat tucked beneath the window. The one with the lock I never bothered to change. The one that had held the fragments of a life I rarely spoke of. I opened it slowly. Inside was the vest. Dark navy, still crisp from the dry cleaner starch years ago. Folded precisely, just the way he used to fold his dress blues, and nestled within the fabric, tucked into a corner pocket, was the cufflink. Just one. The other had been lost in Afghanistan. But this one had been with me through every interview, every boardroom standoff, every closed-door conversation where my title was doubted before I even spoke. I held it between my fingers, letting the metal warm to my skin. It wasn't about jewelry. It was about what it represented. Legacy, service, stillness before strategy. My husband had given them to me before my first Pentagon panel. "You won't need to raise your voice," he'd said. "Just sit steady. They'll hear you," and they did, even when my own son didn't. I placed the cufflink back in its box, resting it in the groove carved just for it. Then I folded the vest again, slowly, carefully, the way I used to fold his when he came home. With love, with discipline. The lid shut with a soft click. I let it rest in my lap for a moment before, reaching for the phone. I tapped the number. Only one ring. Alan speaking. "Hi," I said quietly. "It's me." His voice softened. "Helen." I didn't rush, neither did he. That's the thing about people like us. We learned that silence isn't absence, it's armor. It's where you find the breath between storms. "Thank you," I said, "for not saying too much." There was a pause. Then Alan spoke, calm, steady, the way I remembered from years of briefings. "Sometimes silence is the lesson." I closed my eyes. I could still hear the applause from earlier echoing in that hall. The way Brandon had stood frozen. The way people had started to realize, not just what I had done, but who I had chosen to be when no one was looking. A mother, a professional, a woman who had built something without the need to post about it every day. I didn't need to correct him when he once called me a retired nobody. He was wrong, of course, but not because I needed him to know it. I needed to know it. And I did. After I hung up with Alan, I placed the wooden box back in the chest and slid it beneath the window, letting the light fall across the top like a closing curtain. Then, I walked into the living room, picked up the small notepad I used for letters I never sent, and wrote the final line. He called me a retired nobody, but I was never just retired, and I was never a nobody. I smiled, because that's the beauty of silence. It gives you time to remember who you are, not who they told you to be. To anyone who's ever been underestimated, anyone who's ever been told they're too old, too quiet, too done, or too much, I see you. We are not done. We are not invisible. We are not just retired. And we are never nobodies. We are the ones who raised the loud ones. We are the ones who stayed silent so others could shine. We are the ones who built legacies in the quiet, not for applause, but for meaning. And when the day comes that the world realizes what we've done, not even for them, but in spite of them, we don't need to say, "I told you so." We just smile, fold the vest, close the box, and live. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever been underestimated too? Let me know in the comments, because some silences speak louder than any shout.